Andrew Hamer. Do you think we're wired differently in our ability to adopt or to change accent?
I don't think we're actually wired differently in terms of the way we process language in our brains. But it does look as though people who are musical, at least it's sometimes been claimed that people who are very musical switch their accents more readily than people who aren't. Whether that's because they're more sensitive to sound and used to dealing with things like intonation changes, for example. So they're listening to the tunes of the language and locking onto those tunes. That's something possibly in that. But the evidence is anecdotal. I don't think there's actually ever been any research, not that I know of anyway, on that area.
So with a knowledge of the history of the language, how does that impact on how me and you are speaking to each other now? And we're speaking in slightly different accents. I can hear that myself.
We're all products of our history, and lots of forces work through history to produce variations in language all the time. Now, some of those variations might be the result of contact between different groups of peoples, and some might be the results of things working within the language itself.
And then we also have our own personal histories, don't we? So you can hear I speak a form of southern speech, some people might call it estuary and so on. Now, listening to you, there's traces of different things there. That must be to do with your personal history.
Absolutely. I started off life in Blackpool, so as a small child I had quite a strong Lancashire accent. Married a Scot and was a student in Edinburgh, so I got quite a bit of Scottish in my voice. Lived in Scandinavia for a couple of years, ended up in Liverpool, and so there's a whole mishmash going on there. And that sort of says something about why we change our accents as well. It's who we associate with and who we want to associate with. We all make assumptions about people all the time, partly on the basis of their language, and if we do decide that we like someone, the odds are that our language will, if we're in contact with them enough, will begin to move a little bit towards their language. This is particularly important, of course, in teenage and young adults, because they're a very mobile group. They're trying to find out about themselves. Who are they? Which group do they belong to?
Now, these demarcations and blurrings and where I adopt the way you speak and you adopt the way I speak, is that actually one of the main sources of language change?
It can be. And one reason why people do change their accents is if they move into a city. They either have to become part of the identity of that city, in which case they may very well adopt the language features of that city, or they may decide they prefer not to be part of that area, if you like, because they hold things against it, possibly on socio-economic and non-linguistic grounds. They don't like the place they live in, and therefore they won't adopt the language of it.
I hate the Leicester accent. I actually hate the Leicester accent. It sounds very common. I used to say butter or water. And I think since then I must have thought about it and stopped myself and tried to speak properly, as it were. Friends actually who grew up not far from where I live to this day still have quite a strong Leicester accent. And considering we don't live very far from each other, I mean, I've got nothing against them. Obviously they sound the way they do and they're still my friends, but it's not the way I would choose to speak. Some of them do take the mick a little bit about how I speak. Oh, I'm speaking posh. But I don't see it as posh. I think I see it as more of a neutral accent, really. Just accentless. But neutral, I'd like to think it is. And perhaps I think maybe it comes from people treating me differently. Living in Leicester, being Asian, coming from Belgrave. That's probably had quite a big impact on the way I speak and the way I carry myself.
So, all this variation, it's terrible really, because what it's doing, you see, is it's stopping children from acquiring standard English. It's getting in the way. They're saying use lot, they're saying I ain't done nothing, and it's preventing them from acquiring standard English. What do you think? Dr. Andrew Hamer.
What seems to work best, both within the children's own minds, if you like, is to make the children aware that there's informal speech and there's formal speech. There are informal uses of language and formal. And written language is a more formal type of spoken language. So it's fine for a child to say, I ain't done nothing. But in writing an essay, he or she has to learn, I haven't done anything. We're all actually bilinguals, and we can switch our accents quite dramatically.
So it's a matter of knowing when and where. We're talking about appropriateness.
Yeah.
But let's say I'm an ain't speaker, and I only ever say ain't. Is it harder for me to learn to write have not than for the child who says haven't or haven't?
I suppose learning a different dialect must be a lot easier than learning a different language. And everybody has the ability, actually, to learn a new language, so long as they're taught early enough. If children are exposed to different varieties from an early age, at the age when they're soaking up language, because the language learning faculties are fully turned on, they're easily, I think, able to acquire different varieties. It may involve some drilling. The crucial thing, I think, as far as education is concerned, is not to make the children feel inferior because they're saying ain't or using double negatives or whatever. Just to point out that actually the written language, in fact, most British English speakers are non-standard in a rather few ways. You know, there aren't very many phenomena, if you like to call them that, that are significantly non-standard in terms of grammar. So it's not too difficult a job. There's a much huger range of accent variation.
But not dialect, not around the verb structures, not around use of articles and so on. There we're fairly standard across the British Isles.
Reasonably standard.
Yeah.
Reasonably standard.
Meet mother and daughter Suzanne and Anne Boyd. Now they sound rather different.
People assume that I've just come down for the weekend or on holiday. Sometimes I let them know I stay here, and other times I just let them think have just come down on holiday.
Yes. So you're somebody who, you know, when people talk about accents and so on, you've retained your accent.
Yes. I've just never picked up the Liverpool accent.
So where were you born?
I was born in Glasgow.
And how many years did you live in Glasgow?
8 years.
Yes.
Yeah, 8 years.
Now, when I hear you speak, I can only hear Liverpool. I can't hear any Glasgow at all.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah, it is. You know, but if I go back to Scotland or, you know, if I've got family there, I'll speak Scottish. Well, I won't speak Scottish, I'll speak Liverpool. But if I'm quoting someone, I'll say it in Scottish what they said, you know, so... I mean, Mum thinks I actually sound more Scottish than she does when I do it.
So can you give me an example of that? I don't know, the trains are always late or something like that.
The trains are always late. They're never on time, are they? You know, so...
So you can switch when you're over back in Glasgow, back at home, your mum's home? Yeah.
Yeah, and because sometimes, you know, if I'd go to visit my nan and I'd speak Liverpool to her and she'd say, well, you speak English, I can't understand you. And I'd be like, I am, no, proper English, Scottish. You know?